Hello, and welcome to our webinar on the findings of a series of focus groups where we spoke to clients from gender diverse backgrounds who were survivors who were reflecting on their experiences of accessing sexual violence services for support. And the group was made up of survivors who identified as trans and non-binary. We are sharing this feedback as we think it's a valuable resource to make services inclusive of trans and non-binary people for everybody to use so they can improve their practice, so these clients can receive the kind of excellent support that they so rightly deserve and need. Ideally, we should have a person with a gender diverse background as a member of staff to present this information. Unfortunately, we don't have one, although at the time of recording this webinar, we are advertising for a facilitator from a gender diverse background for the future. So in the future, we could have somebody from the community talking about these issues. However, until then, you have me. I am a white, middle-class, cisgendered, gay, neurodiverse survivor, and my name is Emma. Hello. I've been working, my preferred pronouns are she, her, or they, them, and I am the senior trainer at SARSAS, and I have been working as a sexual violence advocate, supporting clients from all genders who have experienced sexual violence for more than 10 years. And I feel really passionate about creating a service that is truly inclusive at its real heart. And so I feel very privileged that I am included in this process that SARSAS is, the work that SARSAS is doing to create a more inclusive service in our organisation, but also make spreading the information around very easily through this webinar, so all services can use this as part of their research and how to make their service more inclusive. What are we going to cover? So we are going to think about what our participants said works and doesn't work for gender diverse clients accessing specialist sexual violence support. We're going to think about how to improve services, and we're going to be thinking about how to create a culture within our organisations of inclusivity that communicates and builds trust with gender diverse survivors. So in all of our focus groups, all participants spoke about how they had to overcome their very real fear, or they struggled with their fear of not being believed when reaching out for support, and how their gender identity or their gender variance made this fear much more acute and became much more of a barrier, as it was tied to a very real fear because of very real experiences of not being accepted for who they were. And how this caused not only barriers to access and isolation and struggling on their own with nowhere to go for support, but very real distress and anxiety when they did come forward to access support and when they entered service. So our groups also discussed not being sure if the service was really for them either, because they were trans or gender variant, and that the service was historically a women's service, or because of internalized transphobia where they believed that they were undeserving of support or somehow not the perfect victim. Like, again, echoing many survivors' experiences of these internalized rape myths, but made much more severe because gender variant clients were struggling with internalized rape myths and internalized victim blaming, as well as internalized transphobia as a result of lived experience of discrimination and marginalization, where people who were meant to support them had minimized their impact of sexual violence or dismissed their experience of sexual violence because of their gender identity. Some participants described how the service was framed when they entered service. So one of our participants said, "Will my counsellor be a woman? Because that is really important to me." But she was told in response, "Yes, and this is no longer a women's space. Is that okay for you?" Which made them feel incredibly anxious about their presence, as you can imagine. They made them anxious about their presence in the organisation, causing other clients distress, and then doubt whether the organisation really wanted them there. An incredibly undermining experience. So from our experience of supporting survivors, we know the biggest barrier to accessing and receiving support is fear of not being believed, which is why we include "we will believe you" in our logo, in our strapline, on all our marketing. So hearing how this fear is so acutely amplified for clients from gender diverse backgrounds, and I expect all marginalised groups, is something that we can really hear and we can really understand and want to act on improving immediately. All participants in the group discussed being fearful about being misgendered or for not being seen for who they identify or who they are. One of our participants described this as their experience. "The first thing that happens is that I get misgendered. Then second off, they might make an assumption about who has done something to me and their dynamic of that relationship." And then they go on to say, "Sometimes when I look at a service, they might be really inclusive, but I just don't know. And I have that fear. I think, how are they going to approach me? What am I going to have to explain? What kind of assumptions are they going to make? How much time do I have to spend unpicking all of that before I get to why I'm really here?" And out of all of the transcripts that I've been reading of the focus groups to create the webinar, I read this quote and it really stood out to me. I feel like it really sums up the experience of a gender diverse client entering service. Not only are they having to overcome fears of being disbelieved, those internalized rape myths and victim blaming narratives that stop survivors coming forward and seeking support. But on top of that, this huge burden of having to advocate for their voices to be heard, to be recognised for who they are, this explaining and all this kind of emotional work and advocacy that gender diverse survivors have to do. This sounds exhausting, but it also leads to a sense of being othered and being less than. So exacerbating the impact of the power dynamics within the service. And this minimises and disempowers gender diverse voices. These fears our focus groups discuss also echo the excellent work that the Survivor Network has documented in their report, "I Am Not Alone." And there's a link to that report, which I recommend reading at the end of this video, and I think will be a link in the comments as well. So overstating communicates safety. That is like coming through on the through the work that the focus group has done. All of our survivors spoke about language and how binary language that we see in services that historically have been women-only services acts as a huge barrier to access and also as a trigger for distress and anxiety for gender diverse clients who don't fit into a binary gender. As most of our services for sexual violence are single gender, so for women only or for men only. Those who don't fit into the gender binary, when these services are inclusive of trans women and trans men, and let's be honest, so many services have not even addressed that basic inclusion, but including non-binary or intersex survivors, or survivors with a fluid or fluctuating gender expression, is impossible without recognising the gap that single gender services create. There's a lot of gendered language when it comes to support for sexual violence, but there's also a lot of silence about who's included and who isn't included, and in that silence is the assumption that you're not welcome outside of the gender binary, or that service isn't going to be for gender diverse survivors, or that you're going to have to come and do lots of work and explaining and advocating for yourself before you start to get the support that you probably so desperately need. So what our focus group spoke about was being explicit, really saying who the support is for is a really important part of even beginning to think about approaching the service. We can do this. It's an easy thing to do. We can do this by using inclusive language, explicitly saying who the service is for, being transparent about the historical context of the organisation, about stating the organisational commitment to gender diverse survivors. This will go a long way to dispel a lot of the fears that gender diverse survivors will have about approaching service. So overstating communicates safety. Using phrases like "this service is for all genders," or "every person, no matter what their gender expression, is welcome here," is a useful place to start. Many of our participants in our focus groups mentioned seeing trans survivors visibly in our marketing, and the organisational information would really reassure and make them feel confident that the service represents them and is for them. And the use of trans or pride progress flags is a simple way to do this as well, to signal safety. In our discussions, in our focus groups, there was a lot of discussion in all of the groups around pronouns and how many participants were asked how they identified, but then this wasn't followed up with like a frank conversation about their preferred pronouns. So what they described as working well was when discussions of pronouns were used by all staff, and it was part of an induction process to speak about everyone's use of pronouns. This way, gender diverse clients aren't singled out, but cisgender staff and clients were also asked about pronouns and introduced themselves with their names and their preferred pronouns. This was a really good indicator that people are aware and want to be inclusive of gender diverse survivors. Our focus groups also spoke about creating an ask culture, where staff and clients were informed enough about the issues of gender diverse survivors and colleagues, and that they would feel confident and relaxed about pronouns instead of assuming or getting it wrong or being embarrassed. What came up a lot as well in our focus groups was there are many specific issues and areas for support that are particularly pressing for gender diverse clients. What our participants spoke about was how staff and support organisations needed to have an awareness about the added complexity of the experiences of trans, non-binary, intersex, gender fluid, gender fluctuating survivors when attempting to speak about or engage in talking therapies for sexual violence. So focus groups spoke a lot about body dysmorphia and how body dysmorphia adds layers upon layers of complexity to survivors of abuse, how this becomes difficult to speak about these experiences, especially for survivors who are struggling describing their body or body parts, or who are struggling with body dysmorphia and sexual trauma at the same time. So our participants made it clear in our discussions that body dysmorphia and sexual trauma are two very separate issues. Both are difficult and both intersect and also sort of exacerbate each other. Participants spoke about how there needed to be a real awareness of these issues when talking about sexual violence to clients from gender diverse backgrounds. But also to be aware that not all gender diverse survivors have the problem, that all survivors are different, and there isn't one experience of body dysmorphia or one experience of sexual violence if you are a gender diverse survivor. Our participants spoke about how they were worried about their gender identity affecting the outcome of their court cases, about how being perceived as other in terms of their gender identity risked meaning their experience of sexual violence would be minimized and might result in their cases being dismissed or negatively perceived. And this is probably the most important bit. So how can we improve staff competency? So all of our participants spoke to us about how improving staff competency will improve their experience of using sexual violence services, as it will eliminate the burden on the clients having to advocate, having to explain, having to justify and shout louder in order to be heard or to be seen, and will save a lot of wasted time and energy. If staff feel confident to ask about pronouns, if they've had really good training about gender diverse experiences, all this emotional work that would be normally done by trans or non-binary survivors won't be needed, and it will improve this therapeutic alliance, and it will improve trust in services and in therapists, and our gender diverse clients can get on with the hard work of recovery from trauma, making their recovery journey more quick and more effective and more meaningful. Our participants spoke about how this staff competency should be made public. So alongside the information about what services the organisation provides, organisations should also provide and promote that their staff have had training in supporting survivors with the gender variance, that this service is for them too, that this will indicate to clients that in the same way that we spoke about earlier, this overstating communicates safety. This will communicate to clients who are nervous about whether this service is a service that they can trust, or survivors who are fearful of doing this emotional work of justifying and explaining, that staff are ready to accept them into service without them having to face all these extra barriers. So it would be worth communicating